Couple of months ago, when I was looking at the RE lesson for today, Aiden Ballou and the Hopedale community, I thought, oh, this would be great. The theme this month is beauty, so I'll talk about the beauty of nonviolence. And I was going to talk about pacifists and all this kind of stuff. But as I started researching this Hopedale community, I kind of went a different direction. So that's why I put in parentheses the beauty of nonviolence and of community, because that's actually more where this sermon went today. So you'll have to bear with me on that one. I will talk a little bit about it as pacifism, but it's not the theme of it. I was reminded as I started looking at this of a personal story about 10 years ago. Um, uh, the mother of a friend of my wife's who had suffered for many years from dementia and finally from Alzheimer's died, and they had a memorial service. Now, my wife's from Michigan, but this family was very unique. They've been in the United States for hundreds of years, and for some reason they had a house, like a weekend house in Asheville, North Carolina, and they live in Michigan, and they have another one now from the islands off the coast of Seattle. I mean, they weren't poor people, but they weren't fabulously wealthy either. So for some reason they had all these properties, and they decided to do the memorial service where their mother and father had been married in the chapel in this little town near Asheville, North Carolina. Now, if you know anything about Asheville, North Carolina, it's a fantastic little town. Today it's sort of an artist community and very pleasant. It's right on the edge of the Smoky Mountains. I'd never been there before, and it was the fall. And we arrived, and it was just for the weekend, and it was one of these moments in time where the people, I didn't know any of these people, but they were just so hospitable. They were all really interesting people. They had all had careers or something where they were putting themselves out for other people in the world, and just listening to their stories and how they related to one another. It was kind of a big family. I come up from a very small family, so that in itself fascinated me. But I was just felt very much at ease with these folks, and they would burst out in song once in a while and that kind of thing. So it just, when I left that weekend, it just felt like, gosh, I wonder how many other communities are like that out there. I wonder if other families are like that. And it kind of reminded me, as almost, at the time I think I called it kind of this hippy-dippy, weekend retreat kind of place. So when I was reading all these stories about this Hopedale community, it kind of took me back to that place I was at 10 years ago, but I was trying to picture what this place was like in the 1840s and early 1850s. So you heard a little bit about the community from what Marge spoke about. So essentially this place existed from about 1842 to 1856. It eventually ran out of money, and it ended up being dissolved, and it turned into a company town, which I'll go into that in a little bit in a few minutes. But it was founded on this idea of practical Christian socialism, which I'm like, wow, there's a handful of words that need some unpacking. But it was early in the kind of Christian gospel movement that came about later in the 19th century and early 20th century, where they really focused on that text that I read from Matthew about Jesus, and the whole idea was that Christianity was all about helping other people. In fact, I heard it said somewhere that there was a belief, kind of a general belief, that Jesus' second coming was only going to happen when human beings on this earth got their act together. So it's sort of like, once you create a paradise on earth, then the end of the world would come and Jesus would come. So it was a big, huge focus on this from all walks of Christianity at the time. And so this was just sort of the beginning of that. So I think that's where Aiden Ballou came up with this idea of practical Christianity. And then socialism was not a word I expected to see connected with Aiden Ballou. Now you got to remember that socialism doesn't have the context that it has today. This was also very new at the time. Karl Marx hadn't even written his manifesto yet, or at least it wasn't widely known of yet. And so this was sort of the idea that socialism was a concept of Christianity, and that if you were very, very charitable in helping out other people, like the story said, that was the idea of socialism. But then it also came out of a very strong recession that happened, or depression, in the early 1840s, and a rapid industrialization in New England at the time. So you had all these cotton mills and all this industry taking off, and then it kind of got overexpanded beyond the demand, and so mills had to close down and people got laid off, and there was nothing like we have today for a social safety net. And I think that's probably one of the stories about the guy hiding under the couch hoping he could go to prison because he had no money was a result of that depression at the time. So coming out of that depression, with the Christian gospel and Aidan Ballew's interpretation of it, he came up with this idea of practical Christian socialism and wanted to found this Hopedale community as a joint stock community. So the idea was that they weren't just going to be sitting around and being simple farmers or something like that, that there were some other utopian communities that were doing. They expected to have industry in town. In fact, the Drapers, if you know that name from history, the Drapers invented some of the, I didn't quite understand what the technology was, but invented some of the looms at the time that more automated the cotton mill process. They were part of this community. In fact, basically they bankrolled it for the next 15, 16 years. But everybody that was a part of the community at the end of each year got some of the profits according to how much you were part of the community. So that was the first thing that was pretty radical at the time. The next thing that they really wanted to stand for was gender equality. Now, they very much aspired to have gender equality in all cases. Now, the historian, and by the way, I should have said all my source for all of this is hope1842.com. Quite a lot of material written out there. So they tried, and in theory, to have gender equality. It sounds like in decision-making they did. Women could vote and have all the rights of decision-making in the community, but when it came down to the roles that people played, it fell into pretty traditional lines that more of the women were the caregivers and the more domestic chores, and the men were out in the fields and doing more of the physical activities. But it was something that they lifted up, which was pretty astounding back in the day. Then they also had community beliefs, because after all, this was a practical Christian socialism. And so the community beliefs was Christian. It was a form of universalism. So you all know our name is Unitarian Universalism. It's the result of a merger in 1961. But Universalism has roots that go way back in this country. And at the time, there was a debate in Universalism. Said lightly, Universalism was a counter to Calvinism, that only a select few were going to go to heaven and everyone else was going to go to eternal hell and damnation. Universalists believed that everyone was saved, but Aidan Ballew had a little bit of a caveat, a little footnote on that. He couldn't quite believe that all the sinners on this earth that were just wretched were just automatically going to be saved. So he had sort of a purgatory thing, kind of, after you died, you had to do something before you would eventually be saved. But you would be saved, so it was counted as universalism. They were also very pacifist. You heard from the reading that you were supposed to be both pacifists, not only in the way you conducted yourself, as in turning the other cheek, but anyone that you supported. You would never support someone that would believe in armaments. They were very big into temperance, so no alcohol or anything like that. And they used the term moral regeneration. So they really created this community with pretty strict moral standards to try to be an exemplar to the world around them. And just to point of reference, Hopedale was just this small, tiny little community next to Milford, Massachusetts. So they weren't off in the middle of nowhere. They wanted to be part of society, and then they wanted to be an example to the rest of society. So I found this paragraph that talked about their very high standards of moral integrity. And I'm just going to read this because this is something else. So if you think about membership to Open Circle, Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, we may have a class to talk about the expectations, but basically you sign the book, right? Well, this is what you'd have to do if you're part of Hopedale. And it is, I think they had to say this. I believe in the religion of Jesus Christ as he taught and exemplified it according to the scriptures of the New Testament. I acknowledge myself a bounden subject of all its moral obligations. Especially do I hold myself bound by its holy requirements never, under any pretext whatsoever, to kill, assault, beat, torture, rob, oppress, persecute, defraud, corrupt, slander, revile, injure, envy, or hate any human being, even my worst enemy, and that's in italics, never in any manner to violate the dictates of pure chastity, never to manufacture, buy, sell, deal out, or use any intoxicating liquor, never to serve in the army, navy, or militia of any nation, state, or chieftain, never to bring an action at law, hold office, vote, join a legal posse, petition a legislature, or ask government interposition in any case involving a final authorized resort to physical violence, never to indulge self-will, bigotry, love of preeminence, covetousness, deceit, profanity, idleness, or an unruly tongue, never to resent reproof or justify myself in knowing wrong, never to aid, abet, or approve others in anything sinful, but through divine assistance always to recommend and promote with my entire influence the holiness and happiness of all mankind. Can you imagine? And then there's this part that I found very amusing given the current press and all the dissatisfaction with government going on right now. This is actually a quote, or the last part of it's a quote. It says, temperance, nonviolence, passive resistance, moral regeneration, even the belief that, in Ballou's words, quote, the multitude of men are trained up to think that the sun would scarcely shine or the rains fall if it were not for the beneficent care exercised over them by this sword-sustained, money-devouring government. Like, wow. Okay then. So, obviously, you get a sense of where he was at the time, and I love that, the money-devouring government. I think it was about that time, give or take a decade, when the first income tax was put into place, and I think it was like 0.5%. So by today's standards, it's pretty funny. But anyway, so they formed this utopian community, Hopedale. And you probably, if you know your history of New England at the time, utopian communities were very common. And some of it was because it came out of this Great Depression and the rapid industrialization. Things were changing radically. They felt like society, the agrarian society that they'd known, was unraveling, and they felt that there must be better ways to do modern society. So you had Hopedale, which was this practical Christian socialism, but just 15 miles down the road was Brook Farm. And if you've ever heard of Brook Farm, it's where the Transcendentalists lived. So that's all Thoreau, Emerson, all these folks. I mean, I don't know how many of them actually lived there. It wasn't clear, but they all visited there frequently. It seemed like it was a retreat center. And it was all these intellectuals that hung out and did all kinds of cool stuff. And it seemed at some point these Transcendentalists actually invited the Hopedalians to come and move in with them, but they wanted to be separate. And I found that fascinating because the Transcendentalists at that time, their belief was that Christianity was a world religion, and so because they came from a Christian culture, but they had plenty of room underneath that for different expressions globally, Hinduism, all those kind of things. They didn't call it that, but if you look at what they were talking about, it seemed to indicate that kind of stuff. Whereas Hopedale was clearly Christian in a very traditional sense, and so the two never mixed, so Aidan kept them separate. Now, I promised you a little bit of something about pacifism, and I found this was fascinating. So I lifted a couple of paragraphs, and I'm just going to read it, because I love the way it was said. It was but natural that the Hopedale Community printing press would publish some of Ballou's tracts on this subject, such as On Christian Non-Resistance. I think Marge talked about it. The great Russian, Tolstoy, was devoted to the principles of non-resistance, and the Reverend Lewis B. Wilson, who was a devoted student of Ballou's works, decided that these two men, the noted writer in Russia and the humbler one in America, should know each other. Accordingly, he sent some of the non-resistance pamphlets with a letter to Tolstoy, and then an old man of 87 years. Tolstoy was much impressed and wrote to Ballou, quote, "Two of your tracts are very well translated into Russian and propagated among believers and richly appreciated by them." Tolstoy, this gets better, Tolstoy had been in communication with a young man in South Africa who had been attracted by Tolstoy's ideas in writing on non-resistance. The young man was an Indian who had fallen afoul of British authorities. Tolstoy sent him the Ballou pamphlets printed in Hopedale in the English with which he was familiar. Are you surprised to know that the political prisoner languishing in a South African prison was none other than Gandhi? So little seeds grow to great size and create great turns in the history of nations. So I thought that since we're lifting up Unitarian Universalists in our history and trying to be proud of them, I thought, well, there's a nice little footnote in history. So that's really what I wanted to talk about with the Hopedale community. And I wanted to say, well, what about today? And in some ways, I don't know if you picked up on it, but Aidan Ballou first started preaching because they didn't have a minister in the summertime, and so the lay-led fellowship got up into the preaching. And so in my mind, Unitarian Universalist congregations, but I would say fellowships, are a modern-day utopian society, or that's how I like to think about it. So I think we're like-minded people who do not usually accept the world as it is, and we're usually eternally optimistic that we can go out and help build a better world, not too dissimilar from what Hopedale was doing. But then I stopped, because rather than go down that path, I started thinking, are we really a utopian society, or we're just a congregation of like-minded folk? And then really, what's the difference in this? So I decided to compare a little bit to the Hopedale community. What sets us apart? Does society know us by our actions in the way, I read that whole thing. If those people abided by that, I'm assuming the people in Milford next door would clearly know what they were about. So let's go down some of these things. They had community beliefs there. So community beliefs here. Well, we don't have a doctrinal test like the Practical Christian Socialist, thank God, that I just read. But we do have our third principle and our fourth principles that speak to that. We have the acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. So that's saying, I'm not going to tell you what you have to believe, but I do honor that you are on a journey, as am I, and together we will see where this leads us. And the fourth principle is a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, which means as we walk down that journey, I'm not going to pull you aside and tell you, you have to believe this or that or the other thing, and the other person can't do it to you. So that's really what that's about. So the result, and you all know this, we have an acceptance of a very wide range of beliefs here, which is what we like to see. So I would say that we have community beliefs, but not in the sense that Aidan Ballou did. Gender equality. I'd say absolutely, we have gender equality, but then let's go a little bit deeper in that, because that was the issue of their day. I would say today it's talking about radical inclusivity. Are we radically inclusive here? And I thought about it and I wrote maybe. I think we aspire to be, but I think generally we tend to be of a certain kind of culture and have certain cultural expectations. And when someone maybe isn't fit into those exact cultural expectations, we're a little troubled by that. So radical inclusivity really means radical, which means we'd have to all lighten up a little bit. I think working towards a more just society, both in terms of charity and systemic change, yes, of course we do that. We could probably be more focused. I think we still are known for all of you as individuals, I know, are out there doing that every day. And this is a great congregation that has a lot of groups that are doing it as collectively, but we could probably do more of that and be known for more of that. And then are we known by our moral character? I'd say yes, generally, but then I thought, well, do we stand out like the Hopedalians? Like, would people around town go, wow, they go to Open Circle, I bet, XYZ comes from them. Do we stand out amongst the rest of the folks in the Fond du Lac community? I'm not sure. And then finally, this joint stock community. And this is where I'm going to wrap it up, because today's our annual meeting. And so